Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 5 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. I had a fantastic discussion with Carole Marie Downing for this episode. Carole Marie lost her husband when her son was just 6 years old. She wrote a book chronicling her first year of grief called Singing Beyond Sorrow, A Year of Grief, Gratitude, and Grace. She's a writer, a coach, and a facilitator for widows, and she was previously a hospice nurse. We had a wide-ranging discussion on raising kids after loss, and Carole Marie shared lots of great tips and ideas. I hope you enjoy my discussion with Carole Marie Downing. My guest today is writer, coach, and facilitator Carole Marie Downing, who is joining us from her home office in Portland, Oregon. Carole Marie, welcome.
Thanks so much, Jenny. It's good to be here.
So I'd like to ask you to start, if you would please, by reading a passage from your book, which is called Singing Beyond Sorrow, A Year of Grief, Gratitude, and Grace.
Okay, sure. And this is actually from the very first day after Michael died. Later, when Lucas came home from our neighbor's house, I had to tell him his dad had died. I expected to reread him one of the books we had bought about death, and remind him again how bodies look after people die. I had been talking about Michael's death with him for weeks, preparing him as best I knew how. I told him all about how Michael's body might look and what it means when a person has died. We did everything the books told us to, and yet I wanted to take more time and to hold him. I wanted desperately to know as a mother what to do in this situation that seemed so incredibly impossible and incongruent to be telling my 6-year-old. Lucas had said goodbye to Michael that morning, so when I told him Michael had died, I think I expected him to cry and be sad and have questions. I thought we would have some time to prepare, but instead he ran upstairs ahead of me without wanting to talk at all. I felt like it was all wrong and out of control, and then there must be some perfect way to prepare your child to see a loved one's body. But there wasn't. There was only what happened. Lucas went into the bedroom and saw Michael and asked questions about why he looked so different. He was clearly more aware than I was that Michael's body was simply now a body. We held each other and then lit some incense next to the photo of Michael by the bed. He looked at the incense and the candles for a long time, and then he said he wanted to watch Spider-Man. So I did what I never imagined a grieving wife would do after her husband dies. I watched Spider-Man. I watched Spider-Man and I held our little boy, and I breathed in and breathed out. And that was how it went the first day.
Wow, thank you. And that was, I think, from your journal entry. This was written in real time, not something you wrote later, right?
Right, yeah. The whole book is really written in real time.
Okay, about your first year, starting from when your husband died through that first year.
Through that first year.
Okay. I think that's such a powerful passage, and I hope we haven't shocked anybody by jumping right into such a realistic portrayal of, of what that might look like. But I thought it was such an important passage because I'm thinking, as you pointed out, you never imagined a grieving wife would watch Spider-Man right after her husband has died. And I'm thinking that's probably the first of many things that you never imagined doing, but that as a widowed parent, you ended up experiencing. So, and before, I would like to dig into that a little more, but I was thinking we could start by just backing up for our listeners and hear a little bit about your story, starting with what, before your husband died. What was your life like? Where were you living? What were you doing? What was life like?
Yeah, for sure. And I think just to speak to that place of, diving into something so raw and real is that really is the shock of how raw and real things can be that we didn't expect. And it was a very different experience than our life before. As you know, with the cancer diagnosis, my husband had cancer, and it really changed our life from the minute we found out. And before that diagnosis, we had just moved here to Portland. We'd only been here about 2 years.
Okay. And by the way, I used to live in Portland.
Oh, you did?
I did, yes. A lovely place.
Yeah, Northwest buddies here. Yeah, but we lived in Portland, and we had a beautiful life. We were really in love. Lucas was still little, and he was introducing us to all kinds of things through the preschool world, and life was easy and happy. I was in graduate school. Actually, the week before Mike was diagnosed, I had finished graduate school.
And what sort of program?
So I went and got a master's in spiritual psychology. I had been a hospice nurse before, and for me, over time, I really wanted to transition, interestingly enough, to supporting people through bereavement and supporting people in life-threatening illness.
And not knowing, at the time you were choosing that, not knowing that would be your path.
Not knowing at all.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So that the synchronicity or craziness of that, I'm not sure which one, how to frame it, but, it's definitely shaped my path that somehow, I think I knew, but yeah.
Right. Okay.
I had just finished that literally a week before.
Wow. Okay. Wow. Well, okay. So then tell us what happened next. So your husband got a diagnosis out of the blue of cancer.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he was sick for a period. How did things unfold?
He was sick for about a year and a half. He was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer, a very rare genetic type that literally had no symptoms beforehand. It had actually metastasized into his lymph system. So there were no symptoms other than just a little bit of back pain that he couldn't quite figure out. So,
which, who doesn't have a little back pain sometimes, right?
Right, exactly. And so it really shocked us. He was a runner. He had run marathons. He was really healthy, really happy. And so it just, it was like a bomb went off in our life.
Yeah, I can imagine. Wow. Okay. And then he ultimately did pass away. And at the time, you were how old and your son was how old?
When Michael died, Lucas was 6 and I was 43 at the time.
Okay. Oh, that's how old I was too when my husband died.
I was looking at your website. Yeah.
I was almost 44, but I was still 43. So, okay. And so what were those early months then like, particularly as a widowed parent, in adjusting and, just your life?
Right. I think the hardest thing for me, and I had experienced, my father died when I was, 30, and at that time, having been a hospice nurse, I was kind of shocked at how differently I felt from what I expected. And I felt that even so much more deeply after Michael died, and being a parent to a young child is in those first months, just the unexpected amount of emptiness and aloneness and feeling anxious, feeling like I didn't know how to parent this child, dealing with my own loss and also seeing my son's loss, and how to even imagine that we were going to get through it in a way that felt whole.
Yeah. Well, and from a parenting perspective, it may be one of the bigger challenges, that a parent might have to deal with as a parent. And you're coming at it at a time when you're also have been hit down. Like, you'd like to think if you're going into a big parenting challenge, you're going to be at your best and your strongest, and you're probably the exact opposite of that.
Right. Yeah. And I think, no matter, for me, I was so exhausted from caretaking, and the last couple of weeks of Michael's life were very difficult for him and for me as a caretaker. And, to come into that big challenge as well, completely exhausted. But to see, I think, and I write about this a little bit in the book of, to see my child and just not know what this means for their life, what it means for my life. And I was really clear in the beginning that, like, oh my gosh, I don't know that I would have been able to I wouldn't have chosen to be a solo parent. I think there are a lot of people who choose to be a single parent right from the very beginning. And I really laud their strength and am inspired by them. And for me, it was this sense of when Michael died, or even when he, began to get very sick the month before he died, there was this sense of the partner that I had, the tag team that I had was gone. And all of a sudden I had to have parenting resources that I had never needed before. There was always someone to take over at bedtime or when I was feeling fried. And so now it was all of that, not having that backup and also navigating the waters of grief for both.
I remember talking to a friend of mine early on, and she kept saying, "This isn't what I signed up for."
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And that script played in my head. And, as you and I both know from, the process of life reentry, that, what's playing in the background? Like, what am I believing? And there was a strong script for me of, I didn't sign up for this. I can't do this alone.
Yeah. Okay. So early on, what did you find that helped? Like, was there any advice that you got that was particularly helpful, or books you found, or what helped you get through those first months, first year?
Yeah. I think, I was very grateful to have family with me. My sister and my mom were really present for me those first couple of months, and I have a strong community of friends. I think a lot of people thought that I would move, that we would pack up and we would go back to Alaska where, because we had just moved here when Michael got sick. And so there was a sense of, do we go back to what's known? Do we go back to a community that's really strong?
And so was your family then in Alaska or in Portland or somewhere else?
So my family was in Alaska.
Okay.
And all of our close friends were still up there. So there kind of that draw. And yet I really felt like the community that we had here in Portland was incredibly supportive. We had incredible resources, and I can talk a little bit about this later, but the Dougie Center for Grieving Children here in Portland, I had some things that I was involved in, and it just felt like an important place to stay. And I felt like there were friends who had walked the journey of the year with us of him being sick, who stayed present, even though there were times when I knew that they couldn't possibly understand, and I knew that they didn't know how to help me. But having people there that I knew I could lean on,
right?
I think that's what made the difference for us.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned the Dougie Center. Can you talk a little bit about that now? I've heard of it, but I think a lot of folks may not be familiar with it, particularly if they're not in Portland.
Right, sure. So the Dougie Center is a National Center for Grieving Children, and they actually do a lot of outreach work all over the world, really, in supporting professionals in how to support families and children who are grieving. And so we actually didn't go to the Dougie Center right away. We went to another group that was held by our provider, Providence Medicine. They did a Me Too group. But it was, for me, it helped both the Dougie Center and Me Too, both incredible organizations, helped in that gap of where Lucas needed to feel like someone else got it, that he wasn't alone, that he wasn't the only kid who had lost his dad.
Right.
And that really helped both those organizations because he felt really isolated, I think, from other kids.
I'd like to dive into that a little more, but first, what's a Me Too group?
Me Too is a group, I believe it's through Providence Health. It's a 6-week group for families who are grieving. And it really, again, supports kids they kind of have a play-based time with the other kids, and then the parents some time to gain parenting tools, to gain stress management tools, to really support them in how to support their kids. And I think especially in that first year, I needed the balance more than Lucas did. I think, he needed me to be balanced. And it was like a year later, I think, where he really began to see and feel the grief. We can talk about this later in terms of developmentally. He was more prepared to feel that grief. And that's when I really needed the support for him and the outlet for him to feel those big feelings.
Yeah. Okay. Let's tackle first what you were starting to talk about, him not feeling alone, like he was the only kid, who's going through this. How was that, like with peers or the school? Were there things that went well or didn't go so well, or, was that a kind of a struggle at times to?
Sure. It was a struggle, and, he's 13 now, and there are times, I can talk about, where he is now developmentally, but I think early on, his teachers knew that Michael was sick, and I would advise that is letting teachers and school administrators know what's happening in the family. They were incredibly supportive in that way.
Good.
And supportive for him. And again, it really came in that next year. There were just a couple of weeks left of school after Michael died. So that was a short period of time where he got a lot of support from his teachers and peers,
Sure.
Which in a way was a little overwhelming for him, I think, in the beginning, but later on that next year, it was talking to his teachers and letting him know, if he needs space, if he needs to go down to the principal's office for a little bit. And just what we did is create, kind of a way he could just let his teacher know, hey, I need a timeout. I need a break. I'm kind of feeling overwhelmed by,
like some kind of like quiet way, like a special signal or something, or what?
It's funny. I don't even remember exactly what the signal was, but he had one, his teacher's second grade teacher who he would talk to, and she would say, absolutely. And he would go and he would just kind of gather himself. And it wasn't ever very long. I worried about it in the beginning, like, is he, using that to get out of class? There's all sorts of things that, we think as parents. He would really just kind of go gather himself for 5 or 10 minutes, and then he would
go back
and enter into class. So we got a lot of support that way.
And then, but year to year, then did you go and meet with, and as you moved to 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, and as you moved to middle school, like, did you go and meet with? I assume that was probably a whole new set of teachers and administrators then.
Right.
How did you handle that as time went on?
Sure. His elementary school was small enough that there was a community awareness that I feel like he was really supported, both with parents that we knew and also his teachers. It was really just in those first couple of years, the 2nd and 3rd grade years, and he actually had the same teacher for 2nd and 3rd.
Oh, nice.
It was incredibly helpful.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and then there came a point, actually, when he went into 6th grade, went into middle school, I asked him, and I still really kind of tried to take his lead, as developmentally appropriate, but I really tried to take his lead, and he's like, Mom, I don't want anybody to know. I don't want to be different.
Right.
So I really honored that with him. And then it turns out that he'll put it in his writing, or it's some way I let him kind of express.
As he feels comfortable sharing to whom or in what context.
Yeah. Unless I see that there's something that might be coming up that's related to grief. Try to check in with them about it. But for these past couple of years, he's wanted to kind of navigate that process. So,
okay. All right. Thank you. And then we started to touch on this whole idea of re-grieving as kids go through different developmental milestones. And it's one of the things that I've heard people say is different about children's grief versus adults' grief, is that they really do have a limited capacity, if the parent dies very young and they have to re-grieve. So is this something that you've experienced then? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's something I've absolutely experienced. And I think, in that first year, I didn't see, Lucas definitely grieved, but I didn't see a lot. And there was part of me that worried, is he grieving enough? Really happy and doing quite well. And I was very grateful for that. And there was part of me that worried. And then after about a year, it was when he turned 7, there really did start to be more emotional awareness. And I think he was moving into like a cognitive stage where he was more aware that Michael wasn't coming back. There's that more, that concrete thinking that comes in those, school age years, I think was really impactful. And so he had to kind of go through that. And then I saw another shift when he, was about 10 or 11. And I think as he was, beginning to shift towards puberty and just being more aware of himself, as a boy, as a young man in the world, and looking to, who are my male role models, and grieving the loss of his dad in that way. And then now as he's 13, a different one. So I think it's really true.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's fascinating. And you mentioned the idea of male role models. Is that something that you have thought about or tried to deliberately build in any male role models, or what do you think about that?
Sure. I think it's really hard. I mean, one of the things I'd love to talk about today, is expectations that we have of the people around us, and I think for me, one of the things that I've had to do is I really had this hope that people would just naturally step in, that they would see, he needs that. He needs men in his life. He needs those role models. And what I've really found is I've needed to ask very specifically.
Okay.
What I see I might need, whether it's from a neighbor or a friend or.
And then do you find that when you ask that they're, willing and responsive, or what kind of reception do you get when you do ask?
Yeah, I do find that people are really responsive. I think in a way the people around us want to support us more than we know, but they don't know how.
Okay.
So I have found that really specific requests have been super helpful. And even I have a stepson. He has an older brother who's quite a bit older than him. And I even have had to be really specific about, it'd be really great if you could do this with Lucas. And
for his stepbrother okay. And is he an adult now, or is he how much older? Okay.
Yeah, he's an adult. Yeah. And he actually lives overseas. So that's been a new thing now too, but he was here in those, the couple of years afterwards. So.
Okay. Now I've lost my train of thought because this is just so fascinating. I forgot where we were going next. So here's a question. Do you think there's been some kind of turning point for you as a widowed parent or as a family, like a point where you knew, like, all right, like you said in the beginning, you were like, well, what does this mean for me and for my son? And was there a point where you're like, okay, maybe this isn't what I wanted, but we're going to be okay?
Yeah. There've been several of those moments, and I'm really grateful for those moments. And, the first one that I can remember, and I think I talk about it a little bit in the book, is we were out at a play, and Lucas was really into drama, and Michael really loved that for him when he was little. And so I was really happy to see him, without me encouraging a whole lot, him continuing to take that as one of his passions. We were out seeing a play, we'd gotten dressed up, we were, sitting there. I was looking at Lucas and he was laughing, and we kind of shared this moment in the play, and I had this twinge of grief come up. And I realized that it wasn't grief about he's not here for us, like we're all alone in this theater and watching this play. It was like, wow, we are so enjoying this, and he would have loved this. Like, it was more grief for Michael not being there.
Right.
And it was like, wow, we're here and we're okay. And, that was sometime within the first year. And there have been several moments that I just stop and I look at our life and we're like, this isn't the life I planned in any way, shape, or form. This is not the parenting I planned in any way, shape, or form. But we have things in this life that we love that, I hate to say, we probably never would have experienced without Michael's death. And that even now is hard to say.
Yeah. There's that duality there, right? I mean, that's a really hard one. Yeah. I want to go back to that passage in the beginning about watching Spider-Man with your 6-year-old right after your husband had died. What does that experience with your son mean to you now as you look back on that?
Yeah, I look back. I mean, and I really do look back like, I never would have been watching cartoons. Like, that's not what I would have imagined.
All your hospice nurse training and everything else didn't tell you. Open the handbook. Step 1, do this. Step 2, do that. Step 3, watch Spider-Man with your kid.
Yeah. Cartoons were not on the list. And it really, I think what it speaks to for me is, even as I read back on it today, is that sense of trusting ourselves in the moment. And as a parent who's solo parenting, to trust that the moment is okay. That, we have ideas about how we want things to go. And of course, there's so much research out there and support out there. And also trusting in the moment and trusting our kids in the moment. Like, and this is something I'm really aware of, when they're kind of topped off on grief, like giving it some room to breathe. that it didn't need to be sitting there the whole morning next to his bed.
Mm-hmm.
For me, that felt appropriate. That felt like what I wanted to do. And for Lucas, I heard that he needed a little bit of distance from that
Mm-hmm.
before he could come back in. So being mindful and aware of what their experience is and
Mm-hmm.
where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And this has come up for me so much in the last 6 years, really, of being aware of what's my grief, or what are my emotions and feelings, and what are his, and how do I take care of mine so that he can have his in a way that I can support him.
Yeah. Okay. Can you talk more about that? Because I think
Yeah.
that's such an important topic.
Yeah, sure. And it's what I really work with people that I work with who are grieving and also parenting, is getting a sense, especially when there's something happening with their child where they may be out of balance, or, some behaviors coming up, is really, when we see what's happening with them, trying to get a sense first of like, what might they be feeling? Like, what's happened in their day, or what triggered them, or, what are they actually feeling and needing in that moment? And then before we respond in any way, checking into, what am I feeling? Like, what is this bringing up in me? So that when I then begin to go attend to him and care for him as a parent, I've already got my need for acknowledgement and validation of what's happening inside of me. Maybe it's, I'm afraid that I don't know how to handle this. Maybe that's the feeling that comes up, before. And so if I'm carrying that when I go to meet him in his big emotion, then there's usually, and this happened too many times, there was a big flash of big emotions.
Okay.
And so caring for myself emotionally before I reached out to him made a big difference.
Caring for yourself emotionally in the moment, or in the broader picture of where you're handling your grief journey?
Both, right?
Both. Okay.
Absolutely both. Like, the bigger picture of what do I need? And we love to talk about that a little bit too. But then in the moments when we're feeling triggered, or, there's something happening with our child, just making sure that we take care of ourselves, just briefly, naming, what am I feeling? I'm feeling
Mm-hmm.
afraid, or I'm feeling angry, or I'm feeling alone or disappointed, whatever it is, so that then we can help them name their emotions.
Okay. And it sounds like being conscious of that, like you as the adult are not going into the situation blindly, not realizing that you're feeling scared or anger or whatever you're feeling, but maybe even just being aware of that somehow helps you to manage the situation better.
Yeah. And bringing it to consciousness. There's actually a lot of science behind. Daniel Siegel does some fantastic work about what he calls name it to tame it. So pulling ourselves from that kind of unconscious, reactive mode into a more conscious way of being, and that by actually naming our feelings, we're able to activate the part of ourselves that can problem solve, that can parent in a different way. So.
Is that a book then?
Well, he has a lot of videos and books. Daniel Siegel is his name. He's from UCLA.
Okay.
There's a great book called No Drama Discipline, but yeah.
Okay. No, I want to link some of these things, or all of these things, in the show notes, so the listeners can go and find, and the Dougie Center and the other things that you mentioned. I want to be sure and include that so people can find them. Okay. So, and then what? There must have been some other, like, looking back now, other kinds of unexpected experiences or unexpected challenges, how, and maybe has your perspective on them changed from the time, when it happened 2 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever, and maybe you had one perspective then and shifted or not, or, I guess what kind of other unexpected things? You watched Spider-Man, but what else has been unexpected in this journey?
Right. Yeah. I think a lot of the unexpecteds have come from my, kind of imagining what things should be like, and then meeting, that's not exactly how it's going to go, and being able to roll with that in the moment. I think one of the unexpected things for me that really came forward was being with other families. Like, we went camping for the first time, and I thought it was going to be really easy and wonderful and fantastic. And what I really found is a lot of grief came up about, oh, I have to put up the tent alone, or I'm managing a child and a dog, and everyone else has two parents, and figuring out how to ask for help.
Yeah.
Because, the expected thought of, I've done things like this a million times. All of a sudden I'm doing them without a partner and with a lot of grief in the mix.
And did you find then, like your son, for example, also struggled with that? Like everybody else has two parents here, or was it more hard for you, or do you think it was him too?
Yeah, I think in that situation it was harder for me. I think one of the unexpecteds with him is I really thought it would be great for him, to spend time with other kids and their dads, out doing things. And now he's great with that, and he actually kind of leads to look for those kind of things. But in the early days, that was actually hard for him. It wasn't what he wanted or needed.
To be hanging out with other people's dads who are still alive.
Yeah, that he would come back like, yeah, we had a great experience on the boat, but mostly all I saw is that my dad wasn't there.
Yeah.
So that's
a hard one.
Yeah, what I thought he needed and what he actually needed, that was a surprise to me.
Mm-hmm. But you made an interesting point that has shifted over time.
Yeah. I
mean, I think then that's something, that I find I need to think about too. When something was a challenge before, it might not be the challenge now, or the challenge might have changed, or, you expect a situation to be one way based on your experience so far with your kid. And then it's totally different. And you're like, why is that? Well, because maybe developmentally something has shifted.
Yeah.
And now something else is hard or different or whatever.
Right. And they do change. And, the life experiences that they build over time, kind of feed that. I was thinking too, another aspect of this is kind of, I get caught up sometimes is when something comes up for him and I think it's about grief. And of course that's totally something completely different.
So and that's one thing I hear from a lot of people, right? Yeah. There's this problem or that problem or challenge or situation. And how do you tell if it's a quote unquote grief issue or a quote unquote normal kid issue or teenage issue? I'd love to hear your thoughts about how you figure that out and how you might respond differently or not respond differently depending on what you think is the cause or at the root of it.
Right. I mean, I think, to kind of start where he is now, developmentally he's 13, we were watching a movie the other night, we were watching Christopher Robin, I think, and I could see that it was kind of touching him emotionally. And of course, my initial thought was like, oh, Michael used to read him Winnie the Pooh, and I'm sure he's thinking about his dad. And I kind of checked him, and I'm like, is this too hard? Are you thinking about your dad? And he's like, no, I'm not actually. He goes, this is just a really sad movie. He goes, I'm just thinking about like the innocence of childhood and how when you're a teenager, you start to lose it. I mean, and he was really able to talk about that's not what was happening for him. What was happening for him was this loss of innocence, that he was feeling as a teenager. So it was a very normal teenage emotion that because I think I still have that overlay of how his grief impacted him. I'm always looking for it.
Right.
And I get better over time. But I think not assuming in the beginning that it's about grief can be really helpful. And yeah.
Do you ever worry that, like, okay, you're watching the movie and he seems upset and you say, are you thinking about your dad? And he says no. Do you ever worry that like you just put an idea in his head and now he's going to get extra sad because now he's worried about his dad too?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. And I caught myself on that one, and I was so grateful that he was old enough and had the ability to tell me what was really going on. And when he was younger, I would really try to do that, like to get a sense of not like seeding that thought. Right? Like and that's where, when I talked a little bit before about naming emotions is when he would get upset, I would be like, oh, it looks like you're really frustrated right now, or it looks like you're feeling a little bit sad. And I would lead with the emotion rather than leading with the cause of the emotion.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. Because this is one that I struggle with, because I know that, I have read and heard that, obviously it's okay to talk about the person that's lost and it's helpful and all these things. And sometimes I find that, if I say, something, are you thinking about your dad? Then it's like, yes. And it releases a whole thing that may, you know what I mean?
Right.
And so, but I always like, oh, I don't want to put something in their head, but I don't want to not have them think it's okay to talk about.
Right. Right.
And it's
I so resonate with that as a parent. And I think for me, and again, there's still times when I do both, right? And I wonder which one is the right. But what I've noticed is that, recognizing the big emotion, and especially when he was little and really grieving, naming what was happening, he would be really angry. And then underneath it was a lot of sadness.
Right.
And sometimes it would be, friends at school sadness, and sometimes it'd be, I really miss my dad and I'm all alone. Nobody, and so it was, if I could just let him have those big feelings, then what I would find is underneath those big feelings, he would let me know, like he would be able to name what was causing that big feeling, but giving him the space. And as a parent, I think especially when the feeling is anger, I think it's hard to really give that anger the room it needs to release, so that we can find, anger is kind of a primary emotion. Underneath it, there's all sorts of other blends and subtle emotions. And so giving the space to that big emotion can let the more subtle ones come out.
Okay. All right.
It's really hard for me.
Well, and I love your suggestion to lead with the identification and naming of the emotion, and kind of use that as an entry point. I'm going to think about that one as I move forward myself here.
Yeah.
One thing I was thinking about, and you touched on it with the camping trip, but I'm thinking about what kind of other surprise, maybe you call them gotchas. Everybody knows that a wedding is probably going to be hard, a graduation, those are the biggies, right? But what else? Are there other things that have kind of surprised you that you didn't expect to be an issue?
Yeah, and I don't know if it's that I didn't expect them to be an issue. I think there's some, just to be really honest, in my book, there's so much of this is like just the unexpected triggers. Like the first time going to a grocery store that we all used to go to, and seeing Dad's favorite cookie, it's like, oh, man, right? Like there it is. Or there was I would get really angry in the beginning. At school, there was a donuts for dads.
Oh yeah.
Why is there donuts for dads? Like, that is terrible. 2 years ago, it was the sweetest thing in the world. And all of a sudden, it's like, there's, and I think this also plays to the point of there are so many families that aren't typical nuclear families with, two parents and a kid, or two kids, or however many it is. That there's so many ways in which we put that societal thought of what makes a family into the different activities that happen at school or whatever else, that actually isolates kids who only have one parent. Two same-sex parents, or maybe the parents are divorced, or they're being raised by grandparents. And so, I think those things can be triggers for a lot of people.
Sure. Or you even could have a just quote-unquote traditional or typical, family, but one of the parents is deployed overseas or something. There's so many different possibilities. Right. Okay. And, you know what, this is one I think is interesting. There's some conventional wisdom. I hear it fairly often, and I'm wondering what your reaction is to it. Sometimes I hear people say kids are resilient, and I kind of I feel both ways about it. So I'm wondering what your take is on that.
Yeah. I think kids are resilient. I think there's also, a lot of research coming out now about early childhood traumas and the impact of those on kids developmentally and school-wise as they age. I'm not specifically, focused in that field, but, I think kids generally are resilient. And I think also kids who have been through traumatic events need extra support, attention, from us as parents, or, to just make sure that there's an awareness of how that might impact their life going forward. But, I do feel like kids grieve much more in the moment than we do. I don't think they attach as much past or future to it. And I do think that, there is a normalcy that kids strive for. whether developmentally or otherwise, that, they will gravitate towards the developmental task that they are working on, and so, and when a death or a trauma interrupts that, I think that's what can be hard for a child, like say a teenager, they're in that process of individuation. Mm-hmm. And so when that comes in, then they're kind of drawn back towards their family at a time when they're trying to kind of be out in the world and individuate, or a young child is trying to play and be in that world of play and imagination, which is where they are. And so, just noticing that it's okay for them to be kids and to be in that natural state. And when grief does catch them, that we're there.
Yeah.
There's people around them who are there. And
so one of the topics that I think people wonder about sometimes is, how do you know when you need more help? And what type of, whether it's therapists, whether it's grief counselors, whether it's grief groups by something like the Dougie Center, how do you know when you as a parent need to go out and find more professional help or outside help for your kid or for your family?
Right. Such a great question. And I'd written this down, so I want to put this in here too, is that, the Dougie Center has actually a brand new toolkit for schools that's completely downloadable, and any school, it's an amazing resource that's completely for free for schools.
Okay.
So that's helpful. I think there's a lot on the Dougie Center and also the National Alliance for Grieving Children, which I know you're familiar with. There's so many resources on there. But I think, note for me, noticing when behavior seemed really out of alignment with what I'd seen before, if there was a big change in behavior, that's when we went to the Dougie Center for the first time. And, and I think making calls and reaching out and saying, to professionals that says, hey, is this normal behavior that I can be expected from my child at this age, or is this something that maybe we need support for? And what go ahead.
Well, you said reaching out and calling professionals. So who? How? If I'm how do I know who to call? Where do I start?
Yeah, for kids, I think school counselors can be a good start, and I think they sometimes don't have all the resources for grief because there's not as high of a population of kids that are experiencing the death of a parent. But I think, for me, being able to call the Dougie Center or call a local resource, or even calling, the healthcare provider that was maybe providing care.
The pediatrician. You mean for the deceased parent or care for the kid?
Both, actually. Our pediatrician had some, ideas and resources should we ever need it. And it was at a time when we didn't need that resource. But I felt he actually would know where to send us. We needed help. But one thing I do want to note with that is I will note that every time I reached out to a counselor or, to a support place, one of the first things I got back was well, how are you doing? But that was it was just making sure, again, that parental support was in place. Because I think one of the most powerful things we can have for our kids is our own awareness and balance and care of our own grief.
Yeah. Okay. Can you dive into that a little more? And maybe there's different elements short term and even over the longer term, as your son grows and becomes a teenager and adult, your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, and I think, to kind of come to that, back to that first point, is really being aware of if we're reaching out to support, does my child really need this at this moment in time? Or is it that I'm really needing more support? And this is a place that I know will support us as a family. And so touching into that. So, that was always, it was a good cue for me to check in with myself of actually, maybe I need to go get more support right now. He's actually doing pretty well. I'm struggling with this parenting transition or, whatever piece it is. So having, a professional that you can check in with, whether it's a therapist or a coach or, your own medical professional. And then for children, as they grow, just really looking at, again, what are the normal, like what are their peers going through? Like what's the baseline for behavior? And just looking at how may grief be affecting that or not impacting that. Some of those unexpected transitions we talk about, like graduations and proms and things that come up that just might catch kids by surprise. And being willing to talk about it.
Yeah. Okay. And one more kind of practical question that I forgot earlier. I heard from a widowed parent recently who reached out who, like you, is a mom with a son. And her husband has died. And so as the boy is approaching puberty, she's wondering about things like, how do I talk to him about his body and about relationships? And, do I take him to the puberty class for boys when it's going to be all dads there? And do you have any, how have you navigated that?
Right. And it's such a great question. And I think, I actually have a very dear colleague here in Portland. She has a business called Boys Alive, and it's everything about boys, and really, look to her for resources of, there's so much out there about how to talk to kids about puberty and about changes. And I think that's kind of one of that mix of like, for me to think, how would Michael have dealt with this? And it's like, I would have been dealing with this anyway, right? Like there's that feeling of like, that person isn't here and they would have done all this and now I have to do it. And for me, it was coming back to like, I might have been having the puberty talk anyway, because and frankly, at this point, we've delved in so much and are connected at such a deep level that talk was actually pretty easy. I put a lot of books out ahead of time. He could ask me questions about,
like, just leave the book lying around for him to maybe stumble upon.
No, I gave it to him, like, and then if you have any questions, we can talk about it, and then, making a more concerted effort to have a conversation about it. But I think not being, my main thought on that would be to not be afraid of those traditional roles of what we think and expect. And looking at, so many parents who go through transitions and challenges with their kids that have always parented alone, and seeing them as resources. Wow. I had a very dear friend who, told me, she goes, anything sensitive, talk about it in the car. Right? Well, they can't, you don't have to look at, they don't have to look you in the eye. Like they will talk all kinds of things in the back seat. And that was the best advice.
That is such a good one. A good friend of mine with older children told me that too. And I don't know why I had never thought of it, but that's a really good one.
Yeah. Like sit down and talk eye to eye, that's a little more challenging.
Yeah.
To make it light, to be open to whatever they're bringing forward. And I think, to trust that we have the resource within us, or the capacity to, do a search. Google's given us the world at our fingertips, right? Of how to, how to talk to our teen about puberty. Like there's a lot of different books and resources, and to trust that we have the capacity to do that.
Okay, cool. So let's shift a little bit maybe into your professional involvement in this area. I know you've been, you mentioned that you had been a hospice nurse originally, and then at some point you switched gears and got the master's in spiritual psychology. Well, actually, you said that was right before your husband had passed away. Also, I think you have a postgraduate certificate in consciousness, health, and healing, and also you're a certified life reentry practitioner. So you've been very busy, and you're covering lots of aspects of this this topic, which is fantastic. So, I guess first of all, what is spiritual psychology? What is that? What is that education training about?
Yeah, sure. Well, for me, it was an education in looking more deeply at, how consciousness and our awareness, looking at the certificate in consciousness, health, and healing, how consciousness impacts our health and our healing and our ability to work with issues that we've had in the past or ones that are, current in our present lives, and to be more conscious about them. And then the master's in spiritual psychology was, for me, really helping me to transition from a place in nursing of doing, hands-on care to a very holistic psychological look of how do we take care of people, in body, mind, and spirit, so that we're looking more deeply at what's happening cognitively, at what's happening emotionally, and what's happening for people spiritually in terms of their own reason, their thoughts about why they're here, how that impacts their day-to-day life, and really looking at the gamut of how do we care for people on all levels as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And it gave me so much insight in to how to begin working with people again for something that I've been interested in my whole nursing career, how to work through life-threatening illness. What resources come forward for us, especially when something physically happens, and we can't manage as much through the physical realm, and how do we open to more the emotional, mental, and spiritual capacities that we have to meet life in a way that is still vibrant and alive and worth living, no matter what circumstances happened.
Right. Yeah, fascinating. And that's a really important point. And maybe that kind of segues into the next question that I have for you. If you could tell for our listeners, because I know what it is, but what is life reentry?
Yeah, absolutely. Life Reentry. So there's a Life Reentry Institute that I've trained with Christina Rasmussen. And Life Reentry, kind of in a short term, is really helping people to live again and to thrive after loss or major change in their life. And for me, the beauty of it is that it's all backed by brain science in how to acknowledge what's happened with the loss, and then to also begin to shift with the brain and with the mindset of moving into what's still here to live. What do we desire? How do we bring our life alive again after we've been through something that feels impossible or feels unthinkable?
Mm-hmm.
And to not kind of be in the waiting place of just coping, of just surviving. And honestly, that's how a lot of clients will find me. Even before I did Life Reentry, was this sense of like, I feel like I'm surviving in my life and I'm coping and I'm doing okay now, but like, I want that spark back in my life. I want to thrive again.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's really the essence of Life Reentry, is to help people find that place, but to help them find that place to thrive by also acknowledging and working through the depth of the loss that's been experienced, and validating that, so that it's not covering it up. It's really bringing it forward and then seeing how do we directly move forward from there.
I imagine some listeners might be thinking, gosh, that sounds great, but that sounds impossible. Like, how am I going to thrive, right? I've just had this major loss, right? Do you find that people maybe it's not something to take on in the first, you just had your husband's funeral, you're not ready for it yet. When do you find is maybe the most effective time to start approaching that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's like, when people come to me and they say, I feel like I'm surviving, like I kind of feel like I'm okay, but now I want to live more. And I think, everyone's timeline is very, very different, but, I think at least 6 months, sometimes even a year, or much later into having been through that initial impact, the initial phase of mourning, and then moving into a period of life reentry.
So regardless of calendar time, you're saying when you feel like you're at a point when you're surviving, you've got and you want to take that next step to say surviving isn't enough. I'm still here. I'm not just going to live out the rest of my days and then die.
Right.
But I want to do something to, I think you said, live again.
Yeah, to live again, to embrace life again. I mean, I think about, looking at your website, and I think it was surfing that I saw. There you are on the coast learning how to surf again. And I think we start to get, and this is where I really feel like it comes forward, is we start to get like a whisper from our soul, you know, and this is, I think, where the spiritual psychology training comes in for me, is like, there's little whispers of like, what do I really want to do? Like, what makes my heart come alive? You know, for me, it was singing and horses, you know, for like a client right now, it's calligraphy, lettering. And, you know, there's just different things that begin to make us feel alive again. And I really feel like our soul whispers to us, you know, what might be possible. And when we're in that place of just getting through the days, that can feel impossible. And I really want to acknowledge and validate that does feel hard. And there's a lot that comes up about, do I deserve to thrive again? Is it okay to thrive again? Is it safe? You know, is that letting go of my partner in a way because I'm willing to live here without them? You know, there's a lot that can come up. And so having that, you know, the support of Life Reentry is an amazing way to walk through that process.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think, and earlier you talked about the importance of the parent having their own, I guess, handling their own grief in some way, and the importance of that as a parent, not only for themselves, but for them as a parent. And I'm wondering how, if you have thoughts on how the life reentry process, or the process of the adult in this case, maybe trying to move beyond surviving, how that is either complicated by or helped by or affected in some way by also being a parent. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. You know, and I see, like, there's a lot of nuance in there, of course. But you know, and there was a point, I think you asked earlier in the interview about, you know, points at which you saw that you were going to be okay. And, you know, one of those points for me really speaks to this place of, you know, I knew I was going to be okay when I saw that I needed to do things that supported me, so that my son saw that there was more to living than just getting through the days. That there were things that brought me alive, and to show, to, you know, be that example for him of what makes me happy, like what brings joy to our lives, and really stepping into those things so that they feel safe and comfortable and guided to trust that it's okay to be joyful. You know, and they often, actually, with my son, he leads that a lot of the time, you know, and for me to follow that place of like, it is okay to feel joyful and to be laughing and to do things that feed our soul, that make us, you know, step into that place of thriving again, and to get the support that we need in order to do that. And I think that, you know, the aspect of parenting complicates, like, you know, I love to do X, Y, or Z, but how am I ever going to get the time to do that? I'm solo parenting now. And to really open the doors to imagination of who could support me in this. There's a teenager that could come over and watch my kids for a few hours so that I can do something. And then when I come back from that, they see the lightness. They see a little bit of a lift.
And that maybe goes back to something you said earlier on, something about that people really want to help and they're not sure how. And so maybe that's another one of those, identifying those specific requests where they can be helpful, to allow you to address your own needs as you grieve. Right.
And absolutely, you know, something that comes forward for me in that too is, you know, asking for help. I don't know how you found this, but was really challenging for me. And to ask for specific help, you know, there were lots of people like, let me know if I can help out. But I'm like, I don't even, like, do you want to come clean my toilets? You know, I mean, that's what I really need, right? You know, but to kind of have specific requests. And I think, you know, with parenting and getting help with parenting, you know, if there's a tape running in the background of like, I'm all alone, then it's hard to reach out for help. You know, whereas if you look at, you know, that tape that's running and say, well, I'm not really all alone. Yes, my partner's not here. And that's true. And that's hard. And it hurts. And I'm grieving about that right now. And there's people around me that I can ask for an hour or two, and it doesn't fill the daily constant presence of my partner being here, but it does help me to know that I'm actually not alone. And it may be unexpected people that are willing to help. That's the other thing I found, is that there's people who are willing to help. It's like, really? It's really surprised me, and, a really grateful surprise.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's great. We are approaching the end of our time here. Unfortunately, I think we could keep talking all day long. But before I ask my final question, I have a semi-final question, which I forgot to ask earlier. In your book, I think you had a funny anecdote. One of the tools you found for surviving was allowing yourself to serve quesadillas for dinner for the 20th time in a row. Do you have a comment on that?
Oh, I'd like to not comment on that, but I will. It really was, kind of taking the edge off of the parenting expectations, and just, like, is my child fed? Are they comforted? Am I here? Am I present? And having a 4-course meal on the table. Like, dinner time might look really different now. And that can be a tricky time for people. So, taking it easy, or having people over, or going to other people's places, or serving, quesadillas 20 times in a row, to not be hard on ourselves for that. And then the quesadilla thing, I think me being able to fess up to that came from a friend of mine who's actually divorced, and I was talking to her, and I was kind of holding that place of like, well, divorce is different, right? Because the other parent is still there. And then, she really kind of talked me through, like, so much I did alone that was really hard. And so seeing again that there's a broad spectrum of people who've been through so many things, and there's so many people who can support us. But, her best advice for me, I think this answers 2 of your questions, was she said, my kids ate peanut butter and jelly on soda crackers for 6 months. And they're fine. Now they're like 20 something and they eat kale all the time, so they're okay. And, kind of what it takes to get through those times, even as another quesadilla. My kid still eats quesadillas,
You didn't burn him out on quesadillas.
Overdo him on that. But, so just being gentle with ourselves.
Yeah.
Is really
Such a good point. Okay. My very last question that I like to ask, if you could say one thing to newly widowed parents, what would it be?
Oh, newly widowed parents.
Or somebody earlier on the journey than you, somebody in those first couple of years.
Yeah. I mean, I think the best thing that I can say that's taken me time to come to is, your family is whole, just as it is. And there will be that place of missing always, but to come to that awareness of that, it actually takes me to a quote that I read by Michelle Obama in her new book Becoming, where she says, she was talking about after having a miscarriage, she says, we sit alone in our pain, thinking somehow that we're broken. And I think it is that process of, in grief, we can feel like we're all alone, and that we're broken in some way. And I really am beginning to understand more and more, even though we're a 2-person family right now, there is so much wholeness of us as a family. And, my stepson and his wife, and bringing them into the fold. But for the day-to-day, it's Lucas and I. And we're a 2-person family, and we're family. We're whole. And, beginning to see that over time, that does come forward. And that oftentimes to see yourself whole means reaching out to know that you're not the only one that feels broken, to know that you're not the only one that feels in pain. And you're not alone in this.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's a great place to end. My guest today is writer, coach, and facilitator, Carole Marie Downing. Carole Marie, where can listeners find you if they would like to learn more about your work?
Sure. My website is cmdowning.com. And so you can find me there. I also have a Facebook page. And then my book, Singing Beyond Sorrow, is on a lot of different platforms as well, and you can find me through that.
Okay, yep, and I spotted it on Amazon, so we'll be sure and put a link, excuse me, a link in the show notes to your website and your book as well. So fantastic. Carole Marie, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jenny. It's been a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Carole Marie Downing as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com and look for episode 5. And as you know, I love hearing from listeners, and so many of you have written in with such interesting questions, and I've gone out looking for experts to answer them in future episodes. In fact, next week's episode, my guest and I will tackle some of the questions that came in. Keep the questions coming. Head over to widowedparentpodcast.com, and you'll find a quick one-question survey where you can submit your questions and challenges. And hey, if you're enjoying the podcast so far, please do head over to iTunes and subscribe, which is always free. And if you'd like to help the podcast reach more people, it would help a lot if you would give it a 5-star rating and leave a brief review comment while you're there. Thanks for listening. Until next week, keep smiling.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.